So, I was halfway across the third book in the Takeshi Kovacs trilogy when I heard about Netflix producing an adaptation of the first book. I finished the series and I kinda liked it, but Netflix's adaptation announcement got me intrigued. On one hand, I was never a fan of Netflix's productions, and on the other, I was kinda hyped about the cyberpunk revival on the mainstream, Ghost in the Shell, Blade Runner, 2049, etc. Later, I ended up discussing with a friend, how the hell are they going to make this first-person narrator protagonist kind of book into a TV show format? In the numbness of alcohol, or sometimes unwarranted cynicism, and the classic youthful arrogance, we concluded that they wouldn't do it right. So it came out, and I watched it all in 3 or 4 days. So first, to answer my question, how are they going to make a first-person narrator protagonist book to have a TV show dynamic? The answer was simple, silly. Adaptation. Adaptation was my answer, but that's a vague one, because an adaptation is always a process and it can be structured in a multitude of approaches, methods, and intentions. And for the creation of this show, the staff decided that the name of the game was gonna be condensation. The oversimplification of places, ideas, characters is intended to better fit in the show format narrative. New characters, non-existent in the book, get in and out, presenting an utterly derisory depth, serving only to reinforce some ideas and tried work concepts. Everything's pretty simple and clear. Ortega's mom is a classic ultra-conservative housewife who at first waved at the possibility of adding depth to an unique Ortega storyline, but all her sequences can be summed up by Ortega getting sulky about the old woman's archaic religiosity. This practice of condensing scattered elements of the book into simpler figures provides a series of bad experiences that undermine the credibility of the show here and there. Up until episode 3 I was still hanging on tight, but the scene of the fight between the couple also shit on top of my last hopes, which were the action scenes. In later episodes we had other samples, but that was when I woke up to their inability to film fight scenes and action scenes in general. Besides the addiction of the excessive cuts, the choreography was also very shabby, and at around half of the show it's evident that there's no life outside of Kovacs' storyline, especially when they went for the grandma in the body of a Nazi Russian thug sequence. It wasn't a bad idea on itself, but the execution killed it bloody. Absolutely nothing productive came from that. It wasn't a good drama in the dialogue between Grandma and Ortega. It wasn't good comic relief in the family dinner scene. It served at most as cheap shock value and opportunity for more badly written dialogues, especially considering they were going to make a similar point with the relieving of Lizzie's mother later on. The show doesn't spare us the time is money adaptation moves, and as such we got the torture sequence. In the book, Kovacs escapes that through a more elaborate strategy, and that leads us to the introduction of other characters and a relevant plot change. Whereas in the show, all that is summed up to him having a classic cathartic awakening that obviously involves Falconer, and just killing everyone involved. Everything is about delivering the message in the shortest time possible. It all ties in as a direct opposition of the core approach of the book. In there, much like in other cyberpunk novels like William Gibson's books, immersion happens indirectly. The conception of world is composed through individual experience. The narrator throws names, references, concepts, places that the viewer is not ready to understand. He doesn't belong there yet, but eventually he will. You have to kind of sort things out alongside Kovacs, to a point in which you share the character's mind and knowledge, his memory, his judgment, and there will always be stuff left at your own discretion, because one simply can't know it all. The show has no idea how to even mimic that approach, so it doesn't take risks. They keep elucidating as much as possible, summarizing, synthesizing to simpler common elements. If Cull is the center of the universe in the show, in the book she's a distant memory, a fleeting influence over Kovacs' mind that comes to make sense when her reflections and paraphrases about war show some sort of universal, timeless wisdom that guides Kovacs only in thought, but much lesser than Vidora's teachings and his own experience as envoy. I don't know, but that seems a little richer narratively than to summarize things to a repressed, interrupted love. The heart of the book is the battle for individuality in an expansive universe so fleeting and transient, where the firm foundations, lie in the hands of people who hold power. Typical cyberpunk stuff, and plus the character development. The rest of the trilogy will later show that Richard Morgan was further commenting on the act of war, its aftermath, the psychology of the whole thing, but all this key subtext never comes out at once, simply because that's not how the world works. That's not how art works. The book denies the easy catharsis, evades the synthetic climax trap. Quell from the books fought for the poor and miserable on Covet's planet, her trajectory being a clear allusion to communist leaders and guerrillas. So it's easy to see how making her the leader of an exotic folkloric force, a cosmic figure, a lover, and a constant Deus Ex 2 for Covet's fits in the condensation inclinations. At around episode 6, there's a fight between Covet's and Cadman, and in the book that was legitimately a moment I considered Covet's could die, considering the whole sequence and how Richard Morgan created an oppressive atmosphere. But in the show, it never occurred to me that Covet's and the Surprise Ortega in the case, it never occurred to me that they wouldn't handle it by themselves. Safe bet, because just like that they bit the shit out of boosted Cadman Plus, the supposedly worst threat in the show so far. The whole sequence was so particularly badly filmed, with annoying cuts and closes to expressions in the crowd and to the character carnage, that it emulated the editing of bad fights in anime, but without the relief of being an unpretentious shonen. So hence, of course, this type of inclination to the immediacy and condescending resources glues to the very storytelling, and effortlessly we completely lose sense of threat, danger, suspense, which should be a constant premise in a noir detective plot, and even more so in cyberpunk. And I can't go without talking about Covet's himself. The show basically depicted him as a poor creature, and at around the last 3 episodes I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. Book Covet's is a character that someone mentally healthy or stable shouldn't sympathize with, but he's an easy idolatry trap for edgy kids. I had moments of identification and contempt with him, but overall he was certainly more interesting being an anti-hero without need or wish for redemption. He was the very definition of rogue in the books, never having been one of the good guys. He only quit the envoys because of PTSD and war traumas that made him tired of the stupidity of the chain of command and the very act of war, but nothing ever made him become a romantic idealist. In fact, even in the 3rd book, when he actually meets Quell herself, he never gets overwhelmed by her revolutionary ideals, always remaining as neutral as his own aptitude for violence and personal quarrels allow him to. And speaking of characters, there is not much to say except disgust. The choices made to complete the side character storylines were almost unanimously painful, and the show exploited to the last breath the abuse of involuntary sidekicks like Ortega does with Nikki, etc. Elliot, who was a spiteful harsh man in the book, became the black sidekick dude used as a comic relief. And Liz's narrative I simply choose to forget. And the end of the show presented us with this supreme ultimate cheesy decision, as one couldn't expect any different. By the law of condensation and synthesizing, it only makes sense to totally suppress Raylene Kawahara of the show, so that in the end, for absolutely no reason but shock and romanticizing value, she would be liquefied in a basin and made one with Covet's sister, to cause the final wow. The problem is that this replacement implied a major motivational and structural change in the book-show relationship. In the book, Kawahara, who had a backstory to develop her evil persona with slave labor, exploitation of world, genocides, etc., was just mean and a much more dangerous meth than Bancroft. Whereas in the show, Covet's sister was cool as far as we knew. Then, just because she was so crazy about her brother, she built an entire empire, made a really big mess, and was even behind Cal's defeat and death back in the day. So it's basically the paramount of romanticizing and cheekiness, making her basically an anime villain, and a silly one at that. And even if you can't accept it, we have it that from a narrative point of view, she turned into a villain out of nothing. And that simply is not enough for us to account her as an actual threat. Everything loses power when we cannot have a real dimension of what she is and represents because there was simply no development. She was something, and for mere convenience of the plot, she turned into another. Out of nowhere, she starts stalking everyone, killing just for the sake of it, switching bodies to play around. Everything's so stupid and corny. So, from a centennial, manipulative, cold, powerful villain in the book, we had the obsessive, psychotic, crazy bitch sister in the show. Amazing. Everything becomes goofy, full of itself, pompous, and for all that, simpler and ordinary. This raw and direct tone from the book gives way to something more romantic and glamorized, losing contact with details that make a tangible world. Everything is straightforward and simple, holding strongly to TV formula and Netflix's patterns, with action scenes and narrative simplifications, and also with the decoupage, like the scene of the encounter between Kovacs and his sister, much like a reminiscent of productions like Sense8. But nevertheless, you can see I clearly failed to distinguish things and fell on my face in the valley of the "but the book was better." But nothing would get out of the way a number of bad narrative choices, unreasonable developments, bad dialogues, half-assed performances, badly directed action scenes, this is narrative, and the final sequence of episodes where climax creation is languid, corny, hurried, and almost purposely filled with foolish conveniences. In the face of all this, I can't help but think that the show is for the book what Ghost in the Shell movie was for the anime. The process of adaptation of the two has gone through very similar decisions and resulted in equal problems where the simplifying trend wave, the need for shock value and discovery, need to be aligned at all costs to the viewer, to the detriment of all minor elements and the soul of the original work. In the book, there's the concept of Experia Flic, which is more or less a genre of film or show, something like that, characterized by an unpretentious action narrative that's kinda silly and goofy. But Kovacs uses it in a pejorative way to represent some idea or event he's going through that seems out of place, too pompous, or simply dumb. And to this day, it is my best short definition for Netflix's Altered Carbon. To quote the book itself, I nodded to myself as I climbed out of the wreck. 11.15 was the standard working ratio for data rats. It was also the title of a particularly bloody but otherwise unmemorable Miki Nozawa Experia Flic. And one of Kovacs, right before the fight against Cadman in the arena, there was a magical moment then, a kind of release, almost as if an Experia scene had just been shot, and we could all stand down now and relax, maybe pass around a whiskey flask and clown about behind the scanners, joke about the cliché-ridden script we were being forced to play out. Well, at the end of the day, as much as it remains a product of youthful arrogance, I was right. It was not gonna work. You know what? Just go watch Kaiba instead.